As you know, our focus today is on raw clay practices from across the globe, and we're really looking at from a research point of view and not how to step-by-step demonstration. An upcoming event, the Craft in America event, which Julia Galloway, my co-host from Green Task Force, and myself will be presenting in, along with 3 other amazing presenters from industry and other artists and makers. This presentation is a 1-hour free webinar looking at eco-responsible ceramic studios, and we'd encourage you to do that or to participate. I think it'll be a really excellent event, and it will correspond with the launch of a green guide from the Craft in America. Welcome, Yuliya from Ukraine, who's an environmental activist. She works in climate NGOs in Ukraine and has a scientific background and business background. She works with micro industries on green transformation and policy. So I'm going to hand over to Yuliya, and she's going to present her practice as a young potter, as somebody who's very inspiring and somebody who's also very articulate about the economic and the social aspects, or the environmental impacts of one's practice and her practice, and thinking through what that involves. Over to you, Yuliya.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Wendy, for your kind introduction. And thank you, NCECA Green Task Force, for having me, and also for all the beautiful work that you're doing. Hello, everyone. From the audience, really nice and lovely to have you tonight. I'm joining you from Ukraine, which is in Eastern Europe. Currently, I am at the conference on green and sustainable democracy, and it's really a really lovely combination and transition to also join you and talk about the ceramic side or artistic side of sustainability. I'm gonna share my presentation so that you have something to look at. So a couple of words about my background. As Wendy says, by training, I'm not an artist. And that's why I'm maybe a little bit humbled to be talking to you all today, because I know there are so many great artists and potters and practitioners. Yeah, please be kind. I'm coming more from the natural science background. So I have a Master of Science in ecology, and I also worked in environmental protection, both in NGOs and now as a sole entrepreneur. And I consult businesses and organizations on their environmental impact and how they can cut their footprint and still be profitable. And the interesting part for me is that I do not only tell them the theory, but I also kind of try to practice it myself. So what you will see tonight is kind of a snapshot of my practice. Yeah, and my brand is called Here and Now, Sustainable Studio Ceramics, but it's a sustainable studio ceramics in the making. So I think it's a bit brave to call oneself a sustainable studio, 100% guaranteed, but we're getting there. Mm-hmm. So, sorry, just a second. Somehow I'm not able to navigate my presentation. Sorry for that. I think I'll need to try and share it again. Oh yeah, here it works. So I started being interested and engaged in ceramics a few years ago, just as a form of maybe artistic therapy, because I needed a relief from stress in my main work. And as many of you may know, ceramics, sometimes it just like catches you, the ceramic bug bites you, and you you have to continue doing it. And like step by step, I started thinking about having my own studio, first at home, and then like a separate entity. And of course, as an environmentalist, I questioned myself, because ceramics is, like, when you think of it, it may not be considered like the greenest art or craft in the world, because it is materially intense and energy intense. And like above all of this, maybe this world doesn't necessarily need that many more new pots and mugs, maybe. So there was a bit of a hesitation and like discussion going on in my head. But at some point, or at least now in this moment, my position is that I'm trying to look at it as an exercise in making ceramic studio practice more green and more sustainable. And I intentionally focus on spreading this experience. So I post a lot, I talk when I got to talk about it, as tonight, and also I kind of consult other small creative businesses. In Ukraine, being sustainable for creative industry is not very mainstream. It's not like the first or second thing that people and entrepreneurs and artists think about. So it's like in the early stage. So there is a lot to do in terms of sharing experience and just inspiring people to try considering these matters. The scheme you see right now is a representation of a conception that is called the life cycle, or the life cycle of a product, or of a product. And it's like we can analyze any product or any process using this approach. It actually shows us that there are different stages. Like, for example, if we need to produce something, we first need to extract raw materials, then manufacture this product, like physically make it, distribute or ship it somewhere. Then there is some period when the product is being used, and then at the end of its life cycle, it's being disposed or recycled. And from what we are interested in from the environmental standpoint is, how do these stages influence the environment? So are there any emissions? Are there any direct physical impacts? Is there any waste being generated, and so on? And like if we would look at the classical or like conventional life cycle of a product, cycle won't be closed. It won't be a circle. It will be like a half circle, because after disposal, these materials will be lost for the production cycle, right? They will be disposed somewhere on a landfill, for example. But here we are looking more on a like circular economy life cycle, where we see that waste from a particular process can become a material for another product. And this is what I'm like kind of trying to do in my practice. Of course, it's like super far from ideal, but sorry. But what I'm trying to do today is what I want to do is to talk about like some of the particular practices I'm using that help me to move my practice more to this circular concept. So stage one, raw materials. And when we look at raw materials, what are the environmental considerations that we may take into account? or what are the options that are more preferable? And first of all, we are talking about local materials, because the nearer the source of a particular clay, for example, or mineral is to our site of production, our studio, the less emissions from transporting it we emit. So, for example, in my country, in Ukraine, deposits, and we have kind of all right commercial ceramic bodies being sold. They are cheap and they are very close to us. So like by default, many potters use them. There are also options to buy really great and fine and expensive ceramic masses from Germany, also from Italy, sometimes from the United States. I personally, at this moment, do not use them, also because of these shipping emissions. And one of the examples I wanted to share with you is this project we had 2 years ago with a Slovenian artist and ceramicist, Anja Slapničar, who is from Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia. I had an internship with her at her studio, and we spent 3 months researching the rich geology of Slovenia. It's like a small country in Eastern Europe with lots of mountains in different climatic zones. So we would just drive into the mountains and take samples of different materials, not necessarily clay, but also stones and dirt, and whatever we could find, we would take a small portion and then go back to the studio, clean it, and make tests, and then try to produce functional ceramics out of it. And the goal of this whole 3 months project was to produce a series of tableware using only these local wild materials. And we called it rock to bowl, which actually kind of a self-explanatory, because we physically took rocks and crushed them and make bowls and cups out of them. And there was an exhibition at the end. And for me, it was like super interesting experience and also like transformative in a way, because the very fact you can do ceramics, you can do physical objects out of nothing, like not buying anything, not going to the shop, not producing this packaging waste from buying the materials, and also connecting to local geology, local history and culture, producing very unique tableware that like couldn't be copied, could anywhere else. Like if you go to any other place, you would have other minerals and you would have other kinds of ceramics. It really was something very important for me personally. And also it was an exercise in sustainability, because we used these very local, very natural materials. So other considerations or other preferences in terms of raw materials for the life cycle is trying, if you are buying the materials, it's better to stick to certified, like for example, as sustainable, for example, ISO 14,000 or other international certifications that show that this material was extracted and manufactured in a particular way without violations of environmental law, for example. Of course, reclaimed clays and glazes are also a very good practice to save waste and also to save costs. And I try to do it as much as possible. Yeah, recycled is, I think, it's almost the same as reclaimed. And one other consideration is about the supply chain. Some of you may know that if you buy a material, for example, a particular pigment like cobalt oxide, and if you want to try and check where this cobalt comes from, like which country, which manufacturer, which mine, and how it was extracted and who worked on these premises. Sometimes it's really, really difficult to get this information, and the suppliers do not often give it to you. And it is especially a problem in ceramics and in countries, for example, like Ukraine, where there is no this culture of actually caring where your product comes from. But it's super important because sometimes there are severe violations of human rights or environmental problems associated with extracting a particular material or component. So next step after we obtained our raw materials is manufacturing. So like the way you actually produce your ceramic items. And what I'm trying to do on this stage, it's not that much to be proud of, but some of the steps or considerations is energy efficiency in all this process. Multiple studies that shows that the major chunk of environmental footprint from ceramic production comes from firing, because we fire to high temperatures, and it requires a lot of fuel or electricity, which end up in CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So any steps to lessen the energy use in ceramics productions really matters a lot in the ceramic footprint overall. I'm trying to use single firing, but I wouldn't say it's easy. It requires a lot of technical expertise and experimentations, but there are some combinations of clays and glazes that I already know how to single fire, while others are still hard to do this way. Another thing in manufacturing is waste management, and there are many types of waste in a ceramic studio. Some are more like household waste, for example, like packaging or paper or plastic bottles from drinking water or whatever. And it's relatively easy to minimize them and then to send them to recycling. And it's not that easy with studio waste, like for example, glaze waste or waste of chemical materials and so on. I found kind of my own way to deal with them, and I will show it at the like in a couple of minutes. And another consideration is, unless you are dependent on like selling big batches of ceramics, for me, like it's better to concentrate on quality versus quantity, if it's possible, in a particular business model, I would say. Yeah, so I'm also juggling with this on how not to be dependent on selling too many of identical items and versus like designing fewer items, maybe at higher costs and so on. So there is less footprint per one item. Another stage is distribution, which is how does this product gets to the final customers, being through retail, like shops or craft shows, or like shipping by mail. At this moment, I ship. So like I don't work with retail anymore. I mostly sell through Etsy platform, which is an e-commerce platform, and I send to United States because where's the majority of customers from, which of course is associated with a big footprint from this air shipping by plane, actually. So what I'm trying to do here is first packing ceramics in recyclable materials, and and there aren't many recyclable materials available readily in Ukraine. So there is this plastic bubble wrap and not much other materials, actually. But what is my kind of option at the moment. Preferable option is this furoshiki wrap. It's a kind of there is a Japanese tradition of clothes wrapping. Of course, I'm not a Japanese and I'm not trained in this, so it's kind of a version of it. But what I do is I ask people who have different vintage fabrics that they do not use to give them to me for free, and then I cut them and make these wrappings instead of wrapping it in bubble wrap. And then on top of this, I got this corrugated cardboard cut in a specific way so that it protects the ceramic item better. And so far, it's been all right. So I don't have much of complaints that it arrived broken and so on. And another thing is that when you sell through Etsy, they calculate and offset your carbon emissions associated with your shipping. Of course, offsetting is not the best thing to do, and it can be very controversial. You need to be really sure that it happens, that it's not just greenwashing, that it really leads to some emission reduction. Yeah, and it should be the last step. So when we first should minimize whatever we can, and then only then see if we should offset anything. And at this point, I actually start question it even more. So I'm thinking of whether I should continue working in this way and shipping it to the States, or maybe I should try more and make it more local, or just change the whole thing. Yeah, and two more things. One is the use of the product when the client gets it, and my point is making ceramics that helps people in some way or inspires them to think about sustainability and environmental footprint of their own lives. So for example, I offer, and it's one of my most popular products today, these travel cups, which people can use instead of single-use plastic or paper cups. And there are also a lot of things that are problematic with this, because, for example, the silicone lids, they are not, for example, of course, they're not biodegradable. They are recyclable in some countries, and also they are produced far away, in my case, in China, which is associated with, again, shipping in emissions. And also, I cannot be 100% sure, I cannot check in person how and where these lids are being manufactured. So I got some documents from the seller, but still, I'm not super 100% comfortable with that. And the disposal. So I mentioned earlier that I try to reclaim all of the studio waste. And this year I got this project called the Life Cycle Vases, where I use a mixture of, I reclaim most of the clay and glazes, as many of us do, but there are some scraps and remains that are not good for anything. They are contaminated, or they are not labeled, or anything like that. So I mix all the clay residues, and then this remains of reclaimed glaze, which is of a brown color with some unknown particles in it. So it can't be used anywhere else. So I take clay, I add 10% of this glaze residues, and then I add crushed shards of crushed ceramics, for example, the fired items that were not that good with some defects, and also some colored glass, and use it as a body for vases. So I do not have to worry about whether these products are food safe, because people won't be eating from them. And also because this material has a high content of glaze in it, it can be single fired and become waterproofed. So it's like both waste kind of recycling, then energy efficiency, and then also kind of a messaging to the customer and to other ceramic, to the ceramic community in my country about how you can be a little bit closer to this circular economy and to use waste for instead of raw materials. And messaging is not included in the life cycle scheme, but I think it's also very important about what are the like shapes, words, colors, or anything else that we can use. Here are just a few examples, and it's going to be at the end of my presentation. One is one of my early cups called Love Earth. And together with the message, it also has a fundraising story around that. So that like the money that were collected from selling these items went to support a particular national park in Ukraine. And they were quite happy to receive this small, but still a donation. And another on the right is a bowl called the Holding Capacity. And I made it for a particular environmental arts exhibition. And it kind of symbolizes the holding capacity of a biosphere of nature in general to hold or to manage all the negative impacts humanity puts on nature. And it has like numbers of CO2, of carbon emissions concentrations in the atmosphere. So at the very bottom, it has 350 ppm, particles per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is considered like the upper safe limit for CO2. But at the edge here, it has 406 or 8, which was the concentration in at the day when I made this bowl. And it kind of shows that this holding capacity is almost over, and we are on the verge of like unreversible climate change. Yeah, and that's it. That's what I'm trying to do. And again, it's very far from ideal, but I think it's important to share even small steps and small victories, and to inspire and support each other in the work that we are doing. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yuliya. Wonderful presentation, very thoughtful. You've given us a lot of great insights. I'm going to hand over to Julia, who will be introducing our next guest. Over to you, dear.
Hey, thank you so much, Yuliya. Thank you for that presentation. I'm delighted to introduce to you guys Nicolle Hamm. She's a ceramicist living in Missoula, Montana. And in addition to her interest in environmental restoration and sustainability, she also works at the Missoula Art Museum and is a studio potter. Woo! She received her BFA in ceramics here with me at the University of Montana. And for the past year, she has been intensively researching the raw materials that we use at the university in effort to better understand and educate us about our impact on the field. Nicolle, thank you so much for doing this today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Julia. And thank you for to the rest of the Green Task Force for having me. So I began this research at the beginning of this year as a postdoc at the University of Montana. And Juliya Galloway and we started by tracing the routes that each of our materials take to get to us at the university. And that's starting with mining, then refining, and then finally distributing. I've focused mostly on the distance that each material travels, but it's led me to a lot of important information about mining and refining and the energy that consumes. I would like to say I'm not an expert, so my knowledge on the actual mining and refining processes is a little bit limited, but I will share all that I've learned about the potential carbon emissions. And I hope that by focusing on just a couple materials here that we can start to visualize the impact that all of our materials have on the environment. This is the distribution route that's specific to the University of Montana. So since I started this research there, I was focusing on the way that it gets to us. So we receive our materials from the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, and that's 113 miles from in Missoula. And the Bray Clay business receives their materials from the Laguna Clay Company in City of Industry, California, which is just outside of Los Angeles. So today we'll look at two materials, CNC ball clay and minspar, and the total of this distribution route, which is 1,275.6 miles, will be included in both of those numbers. And this is a diagram of that route here. So I chose to focus on materials that were mined in the US because the vast majority of domestic mines here use the open pit or open surface method of mining. It's considered to be one of the most dangerous forms of mining because of the health of the miners and the obvious environmental degradation. We have a long history of open pit mining, and I think that it's important to talk about it and show that this is an insanely unsustainable way to mine. There's a lot of concern about the inhalation of materials, and most of these quarries are located near water and they take up a lot of natural land. So you can see on the left here, this is a diagram of how miners will slowly displace material and make the pit bigger and bigger. And just as an example on the right here, this is a photo of the Berkeley Pit, which is a decommissioned copper mine located about 2 hours away from Missoula in Butte, Montana. And it's considered to be the most toxic open pit mine in the world. And it's just one example of the open pit mines here in the US. I also chose to focus on US-based mines because most companies try to make it really hard to find their mining practices because they're completely unsustainable. So by focusing on US-based mines, I can use the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which I'll reference throughout this presentation. And they offer a lot more information on the cost of mining like this, and they also will give them a grade. So our first material is CNC ball, and we're starting off pretty easy here. This material is unique in that it's mined exclusively for the ceramics industry. It's mostly used in industrial ceramics like dinnerware, tile, sanitary ware, and then the smallest portion goes to the artware industry, which is us. And for us in Montana, the way this material is mined and distributed is pretty much the best case scenario for carbon emissions, and I will show you why in just a second. So this is HC Sphinx Clay Company's ball clay mine in Gleason, Tennessee, and this is the company that we receive our CNC ball clay from. So from this aerial photo, you can see that this is a relatively small operation. The mine is not that big yet. There's no big bodies of water around, so it looks pretty good. Unfortunately, though, this company is owned by the parent company Hoist, and they are not especially focused on sustainability. And then this is HC Sphinx's ball clay refinery in Paris, Tennessee. And the reason that I said this is a best case scenario in terms of distribution, this refinery is only 20 miles away from the mine, which is pretty uncommon in the extraction industry. But obviously it's not perfect. You can see that there's particulate matter blown all over the place on both sides of the road. There's a pile of it to the left of your screen. And I'll show you a diagram here in a second that really illustrates the risk there. And then under this little red marker here, this looks to be the dryer, and these look to be storage sheds. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So I'm not going to go too much into this document. This is from the EPA, but it shows us the process that's most commonly used in the United States for clay refining. And the most important thing in this document are these little bubbles with 1s and 2s in them that hover over each step of the refining process. So the 1s represent airborne particulate matter, and the 2s represent gaseous emissions. And I believe there's only 1 in this process for gaseous emissions. And you can see in every step along the way, there's the chance for airborne particulate matter. And if you recall that photo of the refinery, it makes sense that there's ball clay just blown all over the place all the time. But the only part of this process that gaseous emissions are released is in the drying process. And basically a super simplified way to describe what's going on here is that the raw material after it's mined is crushed and screened in water to create a slurry, and then that slurry has to be dried. And this is a diagram of that dryer. So vibrating grate dryers are what's typically used in the clay refining process in the United States. They're normally gas or boiler powered, and they heat the air around the clay to about 570 degrees Fahrenheit or 300 Celsius, and it vibrates the slurry to take the moisture content from around 24% to 8 to 10%. And as you can see here, the EPA gives this process a D for gaseous emissions, and their grading scale is essentially the same as an academic scale. So it's not so good. And then after all that, the material is packaged and shipped, and it's on its way to UM. So you can see down here, Gleason to Paris, Tennessee, then to Laguna, then to the Bray, then to UM. So this material travels a total of 3,218 miles. And this is a very good case in terms of potential carbon emissions throughout the distribution process. Our next material is minspar, which is a little bit more typical of a raw material in terms of its intended use and the process of exportation. It's mined commercially for architectural glass, abrasives, automotive plastics, engineered stone, adhesives, and sealants. And its smallest consumer is the ceramics industry, and it's used in commercial ceramics as well. And then a very small portion of that is distributed for our purposes. So the minspar that we receive comes from the Quartz Corporation, which operates mines all over the world, but this specific mine is in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. And they claim that it's the richest deposit of quartz in the world. So there's no concern on behalf of the company right now for overmining at this time. It's located in the Appalachian Mountains. And unfortunately, as you can see from this aerial shot, it runs right along the North Toe River, which is actually a very popular recreation spot in North Carolina. And this company has annual volunteer days where they invite the community to come help clean up their mess in the river. But with all of the heavy machinery and the chemicals that are used in this mining process, it's pretty heavily polluted. And in fact, I found an article from 2019. This mine leaked 320,000 gallons of hydrofluoric acid into the river and then received a $15,000 fine. And the other problem with this company is that the refinery isn't located anywhere near the mine. It's located here in Drag, Norway, I believe, near another body of water. And if we assume that this material travels by boat, it moves 320 miles to the closest port in North Carolina, the Port of Wilmington, and then it moves 4,660 nautical miles to Drag before it's even started to be refined. And I couldn't find confirmation on whether or not this freight ships by boat or by plane, but because of the mine and the refinery's proximity to ports and the fact that it's much cheaper for a company to ship by boat, I'm willing to assume that this is the way this is done. And because this refinery is in Norway, I couldn't find much information on the processes that are most common there. So this is a document from the EPA talking about the US, just to give us a general idea of the process that feldspar goes through. And unfortunately, if you look all the way down here, feldspar or minspar for our purposes goes through the longest and the most energy intensive process before it's workable. The difference from clay processing here is that flotation cells are used to separate the feldspar from other organic matter, and then it's similarly ground and dried using those vibrating grate dryers, which emits gas and particulate matter. This process also rates a D on the EPA's emissions grading scale, but I couldn't find any information on Norway's criteria for carbon emission grading. So this just serves as a general idea of what happens here. And this shows a simplified route, but very extreme, that minspar takes to get to the University of Montana. So this material travels 5,363 miles from North Carolina to Norway before it's even refined. And then it travels another 9,787 nautical miles to Los Angeles for Laguna, if we assume that it travels straight there, which it most likely does not. But then it goes to Helena and then Missoula, and this comes out to a grand total of 18,253.2 miles for minspar. So this is obviously all very depressing when we think about the impact that this is having on climate change. So I hopefully wanted to bring some light at the end of this presentation. The most important thing is that people like us are talking about this and that we have a task force for the ceramics community. I think the worst thing is to have a ceramics practice and stay ignorant about the impact that you could be having on the environment. For me, doing this research, I've started saving everything, reclaiming way more clay, using my materials really sparingly, because waste is the only thing that we can directly control as ceramicists. And I'd also like to point out that US corporations are notorious for caring only about profit and not their environment. So not every company in the world is like this. As an example, we get our alumina from a company called Rio Tinto Alcan, which is based in Montreal, Canada. And they've made land contracts there in order to try to responsibly maintain the environment that they're mining in. So there is hope out there, even in the extraction industry. And I thank you all for taking the time to educate yourselves on what we can be doing better as a community. Thank you.
Nicolle, thank you so much for that. I'm glad to be enlightened and slightly horrified, and I'm gonna sure think about what clay I use and from where. Folks, I put Nicolle's bio and her website in the chat, and you could probably send her an email if you have any questions. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Josh DeWeese. He identifies as he, him. He's a ceramic artist and educator, currently a professor of art at the University of Montana, where he is also chair of the department. He was instrumental in starting the wild clay movement here in Montana and is also a studio potter himself. He has worked in many collections internationally, nationally, everywhere. He teaches workshops and has been a huge influencer on our field. Josh, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and I look forward to seeing your presentation.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing at Montana State University with what we call the International Wild Clay Research Project that is designed to try to help educate us and students here just about sort of reintroducing ourselves to learning how to find local materials and then learn how to process them and use them to make our work. So this first image is a pile of clay from the clay pit up in for the Plainsman Clay Company up in Saskatchewan, and this is a typical erosion of clay that I just love this image, so it's a good one to start with. Just a little bit of how I got interested in this. This gentleman here on the left is named Morgan Ringer, and he was a resident at the Archie Bray Foundation when I was there. And he was always out prospecting different materials and finding different things to use for glaze materials in particular. And he'd come into my studio and bring me a bucket of stuff and say, "Hey, why don't you try this?" And so this pot on the right, that golden hare's fur glaze, is a rock that gets collected up by Helena. That's a diorite granite and that's just about almost all of the glaze. So it's a glaze that's sourced just primarily from one rock with a few additives in it, and it really turned me on a lot. So I got really I made my way through that bucket of glaze, and then I started to try to think about how I wanted more. So I had to kind of figure that out a little bit. Right after about this time, I was moving down to Bozeman, starting to teach at the university, at Montana State University. And as we I started thinking about how, when we look at all the great traditions and the great cultures around the world, the ceramic traditions, there's sort of a sense of the identity comes from the geology of the region. And so, we see the big porcelain pieces on the right, the Chinese vessels, and we name porcelain China because of its origins there. And it really directly related to how they found those materials in that location and were able to learn the way to process it, to use it. And then, on the left this is a Korean celadon bowl, and their geology, the materials were really good for that particular thing to happen during that time during the 12th century. And the earlier in the Goryeo dynasty, the celadons they reached a pinnacle of achievement that was really remarkable, and the materials were in that region. So that was something that made me start thinking about how it is. Let's see if I can. Now this worked before. Okay, here we go. Made me start thinking about how now it feels like we all get our materials out of one big pit somewhere. And as we see, sometimes that's in North Carolina, sometimes it's in Tennessee, but the commercialization of the product, there's a sort of a disconnect with the materials that we get. We just know that they work, and we want to, that's a great benefit, right? But it's sort of like I sort of think about Laguna as like the Walmart of the industry for us. It's like you can just get anything you want. You don't really need to know exactly how it comes about. Ceramics is everybody's greatest hobby, and it's amazing how accessible it is to everybody. But the convenience of that I feel like we've lost something of the very essence of the ceramic process, and that's about collecting materials in your area and learning how to make beautiful things with them. So about that same time, a colleague of mine, Dean Adams, here in Bozeman, we sort of coined this term. He said we should start the Wild Clay Research Center. And the university wouldn't let us call it a center because we didn't have enough money involved with it yet, but said, well, let's call it the research project. And so we started this thing of just looking at different ways to connect other disciplines with the ceramics program, and to educate students about materials, how you find different materials, taking people out prospecting for clays. And it kind of got started in that way. In Montana State, we have a history. Our founding artist was a woman named Frances Senska, who started here in the 1940s. And Frances was a dear family friend. I knew her. I mean, she knew me longer than I knew her because I grew up here in Bozeman. But Frances used to source all of her materials here around Montana, and most of her clay that she mined, that she dug, and I shouldn't say mined, but she collected, was from Lewistown, Montana, and it was right directly in the center of the state. And she used a stoneware she called Lewistown Pink. It was a really beautiful clay. And I had the privilege of going to collect clay with her one time, and it was really a great experience. And I went, I had pretty good I went to school at the Kansas City Art Institute, and I went to school at Alfred University, and all those years of academic schooling, I never went out and dug clay as part of that program, but I was fortunate to have that opportunity with Frances. So these are just some of her pieces here. And then the other thing besides the clay that she sourced were glaze materials. So she got different clays around the state that made up all of her glaze materials too. So amazing, amazing woman. Let's see here. Seem to be having a hard time getting this thing to move forward again. Come on. Ah, okay. Now, Frances also was instrumental in the founding of the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, and this is Archie stoking salt into one of the big beehive kilns there. There really was a guy named Archie Bray, and they used local clay too. They dug their clay from some areas right near the brickyard initially, and then had an area that was about 30 miles away where they dug all their brick clay. But the landscape up at Archie Bray was sort of riddled with this the residues of that industry, and the old brick clay was always sort of present there, which was really kind of cool. When one of the things about this clay project is just trying to encourage opportunities for students and to support their work and what they're doing with their research with clays. And this is a student named Dave Peters, who went to grad school in Bozeman. And Dave was very interested and very knowledgeable, knew more than any of us about digging local clays. And he also designed this incredible wood kiln for firing his work when he was at school. And so that was one of our early students that really did amazing work with collecting local materials and then learning about making work with it. These plates on the bottom were made with a clay that was sourced up primarily up by Helena. And Dave went through a lot of, I mean, the amount of work that goes into sourcing all of your own clay, and then, let alone, I mean, doing the clay, but then all the wood firing with it was just, it's just amazing. I mean, it was sort of overwhelming, but he got amazing results and did really well with that. In Montana, and Nicolle talked about this, the same phenomenon that caused the Butte pit to be where it is was they called it the richest hill on earth because it was filled with copper and gold and all sorts of other things. But it also it stemmed out of this geologic phenomenon called the boulder batholith, that is a huge protrusion of granite that has formed in that spot. And the reason all the metals were there is because as the granite was cooling, there's fissures that the heavy metals work their way up into these fissures, and that's what they mine to create that gigantic pit. But it also, around the edges of that big chunk of granite, it also has, that's the same stuff that is sort of the bones of ceramics as well. And so there's a lot of interesting, odd kind of clays around those edges. And that's the one of the main sources of different clays that we collect, both for clay bodies and then also for different glazes too. So this is one of the outings with students collecting materials. And this gentleman on the right here is named Joe Guile, who is another student who is very interested in doing things. This was a project that Joe and another artist named Nick Danielson, a student, took on that was really interesting, using local or using noxious weeds, or weeds that are deemed to be bad and noxious and are eradicated as much as possible, but collecting those, burning them, and making, seeing what the ash glaze potential was with them. And so there was they did some really beautiful work with a research project, just researching the ash of, noxious weeds, turning them into something really beautiful. So that was pretty cool. The other thing, at the university, there's a lot of resources, which is one of the amazing things about being involved with a university. And there's we have a soils program here, and the gentleman here in the orange coat is named Tony Hartshorn, and he thinks about clay all the time as well, but from a little bit different perspective as a soil scientist. And he always talks about the sort of the life cycle of clay, and he talks about clay just being rotted rock, and he makes this great comparison with thinking about your teeth and how the acids etch your teeth, and the same things are happening to rock with acids in the soil. And these were some clays that we collected up outside of Bozeman with students. The other thing that we're able to do is there's a electron microscope that we're able to look at different clays. And this was an analysis of a deposit that's down by Dillon, that's called Dice Creek. And this piece up here on the right is a piece by Matt Levy, who is another one of our graduate students, and he is using it in a slip for that piece. And then, I think that just the opportunity to sort of look at these materials from another perspective, with the sort of breakdown with the bulk composition, and then just looking at it under the microscope too, it just sort of, it's one more angle of understanding about the materials. So the other thing that I've been fortunate to do is to travel to a number of different places. I mentioned the Plainsman clay and Medalta, which is just north of us up in Canada. And their operation is really quite amazing. They source all their clays mainly from one big pit, and then it's sorted into different types of clay and then blended for different clay bodies. But it comes from about 50 miles away, that clay. It's pretty amazing. And then the other person I'd like to just highlight here is Star Ceramics down in North Carolina. I had the fortune to visit Takuro and Hitomi down there in Star and see their operation. North Carolina is a phenomenal area for clays because the geology is such. The Appalachians are at the age where that clay you can dig it up virtually everywhere out of everybody's backyard, and people commonly get loads of wild clay. It's not a big, it's still a lot of work, but it's accessible. And so it's, you know, what they've been able to do is start this amazing company, Star Ceramics, sourcing a lot of the clays in the area. And then they go through a process with slaking the materials and then doing filter pressed um, batches of the clay that are then blended for clay bodies, and they're it's quite successful. They're doing really well. It's a ton of work, and it's you know, they're growing, but I think they're doing quite well. And I think, you know, people are just really loving the clays because they're loving the connection with the the unique properties of these different clays that are sourced right there. So one of the keys with that is this gentleman in the red shirt here, which I apologize for showing the back end of him here, but this is Steve Blankenbecker, who works with Taylor Clay Products, and he's good friends with Takaro, who's there in the pink shirt or the peach shirt, and he monitors mines for brick companies. And when he gets into a vein of a nice clay that feels interesting, he's able to sort of get a load of that for Takaro, and then that feeds into the operation. And it's a unique relationship that has really, in a lot of ways, kind of made this thing possible, because the brick mines are really, the clay pits are expensive to organize on their own. I mean, or for a clay company to do that on these scales would be cost prohibitive. So this is a way that they're able to access those materials and sort of bring these local raw materials into the field. It's pretty cool. So, you know, tools of the trade at school, a hammer mill for grinding materials here on the left, that was made by the guy who mines Helmar Kalin down in Michael Wykes down in Lewiston, Montana. And of course, a ball mill up on the right, which is a tool we use all the time. And then we test and test and test and test. We just acquired a new Blau gradient kiln too, so we're excited about that new tool. One of the main glazes that I play with here is a material called Trail Creek that's been used by artists here for many years, and it's a road cut along a road by Birdhouse number 30 on the Trail Creek Road, and we just dig this and then mix it with water and ball mill it, and it produces this green glaze over here on the right. And this is there's a glaze that's like, this was a stock glaze for Francis, and I think many other potters in the area have used this material. The other thing that at the university too is just, you know, clay processing, and you know, clay is all over the world. So you need to go see how different cultures have used the materials in their area. And of course, China was one place we had to visit. So this is in Jingdezhen, and that was amazing to see that operation. Or that city with all the different facets of how the clay was processed there historically and how it's still being used. So there's a pounding a water wheel. This is a sort of a replica. Many people have probably seen this, but they pound the rock to get it into a usable material, and then it's these are settling ponds over here on the right, excuse me, and of course a nice big example of the bowl. We had a partnership with a small school in the very bottom of the peninsula in South Korea that was called the Kanjin. It was in an area named Kanjin. It was a Celadon research school. That we had several students who spent some time, including Joe Guile that you see over here on the right, and they found a shipwreck of prized Korean Celadons with evidence that linked them right to this area of the coast. So they know that this was an area in Korea where a lot of these very prized celadons were made in the Goryeo dynasty. And so part of the mission with this school was really looking at the materials in the area and working on replicating some of those earlier celadons. So we've done some work with those guys. And of course, you know, Shigaraki, Japan was, I was able to spend some time there at the art center, and just to sort of be steeped in that environment with the richness of the clays in that area, and to see all the different facets of how it's impact, you know, what its impact has been. That was a really amazing experience. So there's some shots from there. There's another interesting artist that we visit in Italy. This is outside of Florence. This is the great potter Mario Mariani, who's a terracotta potter, and he sources his clay literally off the back hill, the hill right behind his pottery. And the clay has got lots of lime. It's a lime riddled clay, really lots of lime. But they have a process of he fires it, and then when it comes out of the kiln, they soak it in water, and it stabilizes the lime, and they make these big, beautiful, gorgeous storage jars. This is a big pot he's working on down here on the right, that he's actually walking backwards around the pot. It's not spinning, he's walking around it. So that's a great example to show students. We have a semester abroad program in Italy, and we take students to visit this guy. This is one other connection too, is down in Brazil, that we've been doing some work down in Curitiba, Brazil, with primarily some kiln building projects down there. But we also had the fortune to meet this gentleman here on the right. There's of the two people here. This is Gilberto Narciso, who's a artist who lives right on the edge of the rainforest there, and he sources all of his materials for his work right from that area. Really interesting artist. And that's our grad student, Matt Levy, who's there with him and was able to spend time working with him at his place. And then this is a big crew of people that we worked on building these kilns with. But just different places around the world. And these are the bricks from the Archie Bray Foundation, which is really some of the most beautiful wild clay out there, I think. And these were fired in the beehive kilns there with really interesting reduction spots. And that's my website. And thank you very much for your time. That's it.
Josh, thank you so much for that presentation.
Josh, before you step out, there's been some chat in the chat around indigenous land rights and taking clay from wild clay and harvesting wild clay without perhaps considering land issues. Perhaps you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a interesting. I guess one of the things that the acknowledgement of our impact on, and just even being here with we're on stolen lands all the time now, it feels like. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge that in a big way. One of the things about sort of focusing on like glaze materials, I would say, is that the impact is maybe not quite so dramatic. I mean, glaze materials for an individual, you can collect fair amount of glaze material from a road cut. And again, that's going to be on indigenous land, stolen land in one way or another. So it's almost, I think it's important to acknowledge that from the very beginning with it. But one of the things that we try to talk about with students is the respect for the, for collecting materials, and about not making a huge impact, having as little impact as you can when you're collecting the materials. And so, I guess it's sort of trying to think about it as the impact of this with individuals. There's hopefully a smaller impact, and they can be more sensitive and be acknowledge that they can't make a big mess. They have to do it respectfully. So that's probably the best answer I can give on that right now.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Josh.
Great, great. Okay, hey, Josh, thanks so much. I do have to say, watching my students starting to harvest their own clay here too, outside of Missoula, is that they appreciate their materials so much because they're working so hard to sort of get them, and to get them thoughtfully, and to be careful, and to bring those ideas into their education, and having that be as much as making the work itself has been quite enlightening. Sort of an awareness of your surroundings, I think, has been great. And also, the clay travels a much shorter route. So,
there's no question that there's a greater appreciation for it when you go through that much work. I mean, you don't see clay being wasted. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions that have come up. I thank you, Nicolle and Yuliya, for addressing the questions in the chat so quickly. I think that's taken some. Cool. Bye-bye, Josh. Thanks again. They've been able to address those questions in the chat very quickly, giving some time here for other questions at the end. And a few things came up. Someone was asking about different regulations on mining. And, Nicolle said she wasn't a professional, so I'm not quite sure how to answer that kind of question. Nicolle, do you have any thoughts about that? About different regulations for protecting the workers and the environment in the mining practices?
From what I've found in my research, there are regulations, but especially in the US, it's, these companies are focused mostly on profit and moving quickly and efficiently, and sometimes the workers' health gets put to the back burner. As for the environment, it's the same thing. The EPA tries to regulate it as much as possible, but a lot of companies are privately owned or outsource their refinery, like the Minspar refinery that we saw. So then the government can't control that at all. I think I mentioned in the chat that most of these companies that I've been researching have sustainability statements or plans that seem sort of performative, because they're aiming for, by 2060 we'll be doing this that's better for the environment, and sort of just keep pushing off that deadline farther and farther. So there is a little bit of regulation, but it's not necessarily being followed, and the regulations aren't that great also.
It is impressive how much companies have responded to public sentiment now that social media is in full swing. I have noticed that has had an effect.
Right.
Someone wrote in that there is a symbol including it's a flower with 5 petals, and that's a symbol of objects that are made in a way that's sustainable. I don't know if this has any kind of officialness to it, but I thought that was an interesting idea. Has anybody heard about that? Nicolle or Yuliya, have you heard about that? Okay, well, it's good to know. Somebody also brought up this question about what percentage of the materials that are actually mined are going to sort of our sort of studio potter kind of movement. And I think that that's a good, I think it's not to sidestep this issue of consumption, but I think that's an interesting question to talk about. Nicolle or Yuliya, did either of you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, we make up a very, very small percentage of the ceramics industry as a whole. I don't know the specifics on what percentage we actually take up, but when you think about, the sanitary ware industry, the commercial dinnerware, tile, especially, all of that is so huge. We're not causing the biggest problems around the extraction industry, but that doesn't mean that we're not partaking. And if we're being responsible, that sort of has a trickling effect. Other people will be looking into their consumption habits and things like that. And yeah, I don't want to say that because we're a small percentage, we don't really have to worry about it. We still should, but yeah, we make up a very small chunk of that.
And I really believe if you're interested in change, you need to lead that change and live it in your life. Live a virtuous life, and things can only change when we all step up to this challenge in whatever capacity we can.
Right.
Yes,
Rachel
the tiniest
Jones,
pebble can cause an avalanche. Thank you, Nicolle.
Rachel Jones just put up some information about the chat about the 5-petaled flower, so that's super interesting. And also I want to acknowledge here that a Potter wrote in about that all of his shipping and packing is second use. And I think most of us feel familiar about that when we get packing materials from stores, that there's something to that in the right direction. So you guys, we've gone about 25 minutes over. So I think that I'm going to go ahead and call it there. But I just wanted to so much thank our presenters today, you guys. This is free and donated of their time. And so I wanted to thank Josh DeWeese and Nicolle Hamm and Yuliya. Thank you so much for your presentations today. And especially my colleague, Wendy Gers, who really we just got this all going in Chanda, did all of that kind of tech stuff behind the scenes, making this so successful. And also thank you to Josh Green of NCECA for letting us use his Zoom domain so we could have so many people join us. We were over 130 participants at one time. I also would like to thank the Green Task Force, Liz, Robert, Brian, Matthew, Derek, Shay, Ellie, and Alex Hibbett. That's a wonderful group. We meet once a month, and we have all kinds of programming planned for the future. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to keep working on these subjects. And we're going to make some progress. Yes, we can do that. That'd be great. All right.
Excellent.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much.